Thank you so much for being here. I'm Catherine Levine. I'm an associate professor of political science here and a faculty fellow at the Initiative on Cities. And I'm so grateful to all of you for coming today to this wonderful presentation of homelessness as a housing problem. We're grateful to the Initiative on Cities and the School of Social Work for co-hosting this event. And to our great panelists who will introduce more in depth later on. But we have Lyndia Downey, Nikki Barfield, and Cecil Townsend, and Tom Byrne will be moderating, and he'll tell you more about these amazing folks. But I want to take this opportunity to introduce Gregg Colburn. He's an assistant professor of real estate in the University of Washington's College of Built Environments and is the author of Homelessness is a Housing Problem. His research interests include housing policy, housing markets, housing affordability, and homelessness. He is actively engaged in a wide range of community efforts to address the acute housing crisis in the Puget Sound region. And on a personal level, as someone who's read this book, it's awesome. I encourage folks who haven't read it to take a look, and I'm really excited to hear more about it. Thanks.
Thank you, Catherine. I appreciate it. It's great to be in Boston. I'm very excited to be here. I'm actually going to go see the Red Sox tonight. So we're going to put on our stocking caps and go. It looks like it might be a little chilly, but as a baseball fan, this is a huge perk of business travel. Thanks so much for the invitation. Catherine and Tom have been people that I have cited a lot in my work and learned a lot from. Actually, I'm writing annotated bibliography on homelessness for Oxford University Press, and I was doing my revision last night, and it's like burn all over. So anyway, you have great researchers here on issues related to housing and homelessness. I'm pleased to share a brief summary here of the book, and then I look forward to being in conversation with the panelists. I moved to Seattle in 2017. I'm a second career academic. My first career was in finance, and I quit that and got my PhD and was fortunate enough to land at the University of Washington. And I quickly got involved in a lot of conversations around housing and homelessness. And it didn't take long for me to think, like, I don't think we really understand what's going on here. And one of my motivations for writing this book was I felt like as a community, and this is elected leaders, civic leaders, just concerned citizens, we were playing whack-a-mole. Like one day it was this explanation, one day it was that explanation. And as a result, our responses were kind of scattershot and frankly not very effective. And I can tell you, the problem in Seattle, if you haven't been out there, has just gone bad in the 6 years that I've been there. It's really, really tragic. And that's true in Portland and San Francisco and LA. It was amazing walking around this morning. This is just not an experience you have on the West Coast right now. It's really, really sad. And so the Academy has done awesome work on homelessness and understanding what the causes of homelessness are. And my fear was that this had not been translated to a general audience. And so this is not necessarily groundbreaking research in the sense that most of the things that I'm going to talk about today have been known. Tom's done this work. The problem is that a lot of social science research is awesome, but then people don't pick it up and read it because they haven't done the work. You know, they haven't gone to a PhD program and done all the methodological understanding of what all this stuff means. And because of that, it creates a vacuum of information that allows people to just say, well, I just saw Joe on the street corner and he's drunk, and therefore obviously that's why he's homeless. That's where we default to as human beings. And I don't blame people for reaching that conclusion because it's based on their senses and their interactions. But the data would suggest that that is an incorrect conclusion to reach. So I view this as a translational piece and that's kind of the contribution that my co-author Clayton and I are making. That's the book. It was published by University of California Press. So people say, well, Greg, what causes homelessness? And when we start to talk about causation, we spend a lot of time in graduate school thinking about causal relationships. And sometimes those are easy. If I drop a pencil to the ground and say, what caused that? Most of us would say gravity, right? Unless you're a theoretical physicist and might want to make some other argument. But generally speaking, we could agree there. If we say, what causes someone to be admitted to Harvard? Well, that's a little more tricky. He or she might be really smart, right? Maybe the student's grandparents gave $100 million to Harvard. Maybe they're a really good hockey player, right? There are a number of reasons why someone might get admitted to Harvard. Once we get into the social world, causation is much more complex. What causes homelessness? This is exhibit A for complex causality, right? I've never experienced homelessness. I've never experienced housing precarity. Okay? I've spoken to lots of people who've had those experiences. I can tell you each story is unique. So I'm certainly not going to stand up here and say, here are all the pathways into homelessness, because every story is unique. Different things come together to produce this outcome. Okay? But what is important, and I think what we can talk about, is the context that produces homelessness at disproportionate rates. And that's the purpose here. The purpose of this book is not to explain why person A is or is not going to experience homelessness. It's what the heck is going on in Seattle, in San Francisco, in LA, in Boston, in New York, and DC. That's the purpose of the book. So when we create estimates of the homeless population through the point in time count, which is conducted absent COVID in January of every year, not only do we create an estimate, we ask people questions. Why are you experiencing homelessness? What events led you to experience homelessness? And then we get a list like this. My boyfriend beat me up. I got in an argument with my roommate. I drank too much. I lost my job. Da, 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 da. And then the Seattle Times gets a hold of this and says, these are the causes of homelessness. I don't believe divorce is a cause of homelessness. We could have a national campaign to end divorce, and I don't think we would end homelessness. That's not to say that I don't honor the fact that divorce in the wrong set of circumstances can produce homelessness. It absolutely can. I'm more interested in those wrong set of circumstances. Not that I'm pro-divorce. My point is I just don't think that that's the root cause here. But it's easy for us, because this is in the press all the time, for us to start thinking, well, yeah, of course, this is what's causing homelessness. And so what we try to do in the book is draw a distinction between what we would call precipitating events. I consider these things to be precipitating events, and root causes. And so the way that we try to explain this is with this metaphor, analogy, whatever we want to call it, about musical chairs. And a lot of scholars have used the musical chairs analogy. We just have a slight twist on this. 10 friends, 10 chairs. The leader starts the music. They start walking around. One chair is pulled out. 10 people and 9 chairs. When the music stops, everyone scrambles, and Mike loses the game. And Mike was on crutches. So if ESPN were there filming and reporting on the sporting event, and they interviewed Mike and said, Mike, why do you think you lost the game? He'd say, oh, I had a bad ankle. And that's probably true. Within the rules of the game, Mike's ankle injury prevented him from getting a chair when the scramble ensued. But if we take a step back and really think, like, why did Mike end up without a chair? Is that we didn't have enough chairs. Okay? And so when housing is scarce, this is what's happening in our coastal cities day after day after day. We're observing people who are on the street and saying, well, why do you think you don't have a house? I drink too much. Well, the reason you don't have a house is there aren't enough housing units, right? And your condition of substance or use and abuse or addiction is identifying you as the person most likely to lose this game when there aren't enough chairs. Okay, so we know that drug use, mental illness, poverty increase the risk of experiencing homelessness at the individual level. There's no doubt about that. If I'm mentally ill, I'm more likely to experience homelessness than someone who isn't. Okay? But we also know that those conditions produce homelessness in some contexts, like Boston and New York and DC and Seattle and San Francisco and LA, and not others. So what is going on? So the purpose of the book is to explain the substantial variation in rates of homelessness across the United States. Why does Seattle King County, for example, have 5 times the per capita rates of homelessness of Chicago Cook County? Does LA have a huge homeless population because it has more people with these individual risk factors? Are there more addicts and mentally ill people and poor people in LA, and that explains their huge homeless population? That's an intuitive explanation. If these 3 factors cause homelessness at the individual level, more people with those attributes and conditions would produce higher rates of homelessness. That's a plausible explanation. It turns out to not be the case. So this is a book about cities, not about people. And this doesn't mean that person-centered, person-focused research on homelessness isn't important. It absolutely is. There's all sorts of great research done that's individually focused. What we're trying to do, though, is understand what the heck's going on in Seattle. Okay? And the thesis is that tight housing markets accentuate individual vulnerabilities and produce homelessness rates that are much higher than in other places in the country. And these vulnerabilities serve as a sorting mechanism to help identify who is going to secure housing or not. We've had a massive tech boom in Seattle, and I always say to people, looking for housing in Seattle is like playing musical chairs with Usain Bolt, if you know who Usain Bolt is, right? The greatest sprinter in the world from Jamaica. Okay? The Amazon folks are going to win. They're going to win every time. They have the resources, everything you would want, and if there's only one unit, they're going to get it. So just to orient people in terms of the variation that we're trying to explain, because if that's the purpose of the book, you probably want to know that, yes, in fact, there is variation. One of the complicating factors in homelessness research is that some places count their homelessness at a city level, such as Boston, Massachusetts, and other places count at the county level. And the problem is you can't compare cities to counties because all else equal, county-based jurisdictions will have lower rates of homelessness because you're including suburban locations. Okay, so I can't compare King County to Boston. That's a bad comparison. But when you look at, and the sample in our book is about the 30 largest metro areas in the United States. So what you see in cities is that there is about a 5-to-1 relationship between high and low. New York, DC, San Francisco, and Boston compared to Indianapolis, 10-2 on a per capita basis. When we go to counties, the numbers are lower for the reasons that I indicated. But what's really interesting is there's still about a 5-to-1 relationship. LA, Santa Clara, King, which is Seattle, and Multnomah, which is Portland, versus Hillsborough, which is Tampa. Okay, so that's huge variation. 5 times is a lot. Now, PID count is an imperfect, imprecise measure. We grant that and we cede that territory to critics. The point is that it is sufficient, though, to let us know that there's a big problem in some places and it's not nearly as big elsewhere. Might it be 4.5 or 5 or 6 times? Sure. What we're trying to figure out is why is that gap so significant? We're not talking about a 20 or 30% difference from city to city. We're talking about 5 times. So we use 3 chapters then to think about, to basically answer the question. Can this explain regional variation in rates of homelessness? And we start with these individual explanations that are prevalent in press accounts about homelessness all the time. So poverty causes homelessness at the individual level. If you are poor, you're far more likely to experience homelessness. No doubt about that. But what's interesting, and you're going to see a number of these graphs, our x-axis here would be the poverty rate, the percentage of people below the poverty line in that jurisdiction. The y-axis is the per capita rate of homelessness, and each dot represents one of the cities or counties from 2007 to 2019. Okay. So, and for those who haven't taken statistics, R-squared is just a measure of variation explained from one variable to the other. As that gets higher, there's more relationship, more of a relationship. As this gets to 0, it's a nothing burger, right? It's just dots on the graph. So there is a modest relationship between poverty and homelessness, but it's in the opposite direction of what you would expect. Where poverty is higher, rates of homelessness tend to be lower, which is a head scratcher because we know poverty causes homelessness at the individual level. Okay, think Detroit, Michigan here. The most impoverished city in the United States has far lower rates of homelessness than really affluent cities like Seattle and San Francisco and Boston. So poverty causes homelessness at the individual level. It doesn't at the city level. Affluence causes homelessness at the city level. Serious mental illness. This is state level data. The data on addiction and mental illness is better at the state level. And so we leave our cities and counties for a moment and go to states. But what you see here is that there is variation in rates of serious mental illness in states across the country. And it bears 0 relationship to rates of homelessness. Okay. Washington, Oregon, California, Massachusetts, New York don't have more people experiencing homelessness because we have more people who are mentally ill. The consequences of mental illness in those states might be different than elsewhere, but it's not that we have more people with those conditions. Substance use disorder, same thing. R-squared 0.06, basically no relationship. There are states with more substance use issues, some with less. There's no relationship to rates of homelessness. Same thing with we also have a bunch of other substance use graphs in the book. Illicit drug use, same story. So race is a really important concept to understand in when we're thinking about homelessness. Black indigenous households are 3 to 4 times overrepresented in the homeless population. Okay? But race doesn't explain regional variation, meaning the mere presence of people of color in a community doesn't cause homelessness. Racism causes homelessness. Race doesn't cause homelessness. Okay? So Detroit, Chicago, St. Louis, Baltimore have much higher populations of Black and brown people than does Seattle, for example. Yet they have far lower rates of homelessness. Okay? So race explains the composition of the homeless population within a city. It doesn't explain regional variation. Okay? So these individual level factors are not explaining why we have 5 times the homelessness in San Francisco versus Chicago. So then we move to local context. What is it about our city, our community that's producing these huge rates of homelessness? And this is what I hear all the time. There's something about Seattle, right? We're doing something wrong. Therefore, that's why we have these huge populations of people experiencing homelessness. Weather is the one that I hear the most. My joke is that if I had a nickel for every time someone blamed the weather for homelessness, I wouldn't be rich, but I'd have a lot more nickels than I have right now. Okay. Weather doesn't cause homelessness, right? If you walk out of here with one idea, you can tell someone weather doesn't cause homelessness. Okay? Now, it's easy when we think about LA and San Diego, and people say, well, of course, why wouldn't I go to LA and San Diego if I'm in Chicago right now or Minneapolis, where I'm from? But we ignore the fact that Boston is not real pleasant in January when we count, and Boston has a huge population of people experiencing homelessness. Okay? Now, weather does play a role in the response on whether you have a shelter system or not, which is why visible unsheltered homelessness is greater on the West Coast, no doubt about that. But when you look at the total homeless count, people in shelter and unsheltered, weather bears no relationship whatsoever. Because we always go to San Diego and LA, but then we ignore the fact that Miami and Dallas and Phoenix and other places that are warm in January don't have the same rates of homelessness as the coastal cities. The magnet effect. When I was in graduate school in Minnesota, everyone blamed Minneapolis doesn't have a Boston level problem, but it actually has a surprisingly high level of homelessness relative to other Midwestern cities. And everyone blamed Chicago. It's people from Chicago. No, that's interesting. We looked at it, we didn't find any evidence of this. When I moved to Seattle, the first thing someone told me, I said, well, you know, everyone's moving here. I said, well, that's what they said in Minneapolis. And then I was in a meeting in California, like, you know, we're a magnet for homelessness. I was like, everyone can't be a magnet. Okay. And we include an article, a Washington Post article in the book about Middletown, Ohio, who believes that they're a magnet for homelessness because of how generous they are. Okay. I have never been in a community that doesn't believe that they're a magnet for homelessness. And I've been to like 25 communities now, some big, some small. Okay. This is looking at TANF, which is the primary welfare benefit that typically goes to women and children, federal benefit. There's big variations state to state in terms of TANF. And this came into being in 1996 under welfare reform with when Clinton was president. And so what we do is just look at what's the maximum welfare benefit you can get in that state, divide by the cost of housing to see how generous it is. And what we see is that there are really generous states and there are really stingy states. And it bears no relationship at all to rates of homelessness. We don't see women and children congregating in generous states and producing high rates of family homelessness in those jurisdictions. Another way to look at this is low-income mobility. This is the percentage of in-migration into a city or county of people below the federal poverty line as a percentage of the total in-migration. Okay. There are some poor people moving to every city and county in the country. There's no doubt about that. But there's no disproportionality whatsoever. In fact, there's far less low-income migration into Seattle and San Francisco than there is into Detroit and Baltimore. Okay. So the migration story, while prevalent, doesn't hold up to scrutiny. And we know this, there's all sorts of research on residential mobility falls as income falls. Why? Moving is hard, right? I moved a family of 4 in 2017. Relationships, you know, that you're leaving, which is really hard. Social networks, it's expensive to move, it's stressful. If you don't have resources and you don't have a social network, where are you going? Are you really going to move? When I give talks in Seattle, everyone always says, why don't these people move elsewhere? And I said, what are they going to do in Topeka? One, how are they going to get to Topeka, first of all? Just practically, if you don't have any money, how are you going to get to Topeka, Kansas? And if you do get there, what are you going to do? You don't know anyone. If a family member is the only person who can watch your kid in Seattle, you think you're going to leave that? No chance. These social networks are incredibly important. Okay, so the mobility argument is not to blame for regional variation in rates of homelessness. Politics. So Governor Newsom and President Trump got into a big spat in when Trump was president. Trump was blaming California's problems on Democrats. Newsom was blaming the federal government for its for stepping away from housing support for low-income households. So we want to look at this a little bit, because it is true that San Francisco, Seattle, LA are Democratic cities. And so should we blame Democrats for this problem? So we have 30-ish, 31 cities in our sample. We actually looked at who was mayor each of the years in over the course of our study period. And generally speaking, Democrats run cities in the United States. You may like that, you may not like that. That's a topic for another book. But it is the case. So San Diego and Miami briefly had Republican mayors, and Bloomberg, when he was mayor of New York, was an independent. Other than that, it's all Democrats. So if you want to blame Democrats, that's fine, but you would also need to then explain why have Democrats in Chicago and Cleveland not produced huge rates of homelessness? Something else is going on. So we then move to housing market explanations. And this is a relatively simple. I joke that no one's going to give us the Nobel Prize for this graph. We've known this for a long time. As rents go up, homelessness goes up. Okay, and it has a far more, it's certainly not perfect. It doesn't explain all the variation, but it's a far more convincing explanation than anything else we have in the book. Okay, vacancy rates. When vacancy rates are low, homelessness tends to be higher. And those are related variables, they're not independent. And what I say to people is that if you were to just give me the rents and the vacancy rate in a city, I could tell you with a fairly high degree of confidence whether you're gonna have a problem with homelessness or not. It's not a perfect predictor, but it's pretty darn good. And when people push me on it, I'll say, give me a city that has really high rents and low vacancies that doesn't have a problem with homelessness. Crickets. Give me a city that has really low rents and high vacancies that has a huge problem with homelessness. Crickets, there isn't one. Now, we can argue about Minneapolis and some cities in the middle, but on both ends of the spectrum, it's a pretty convincing explanation. So the question then would be is, if you do happen to live in a city with high rents and low vacancies, Boston being one of them, why is that? Right, that is an important question. Is it because a lot of people are moving here? So in Seattle, when I get people over this hurdle a little bit, then they'll say, well, this is Amazon's fault. Maybe. Certainly part of the story. Our boom is certainly part of the story. But what's interesting is when you plot population growth and rates of homelessness, you don't see any relationship. And this was a head scratcher for me because I fully expected to see a big positive relationship between population growth and homelessness. And we didn't. And so I kind of went into the numbers, I actually ran this 3 times. I thought I'd messed it up. And I realized that there are all these Sunbelt cities that are growing really fast. Charlotte's growing just as fast as Seattle, if not faster. Austin, Phoenix is growing like a weed. Okay? So there's huge growth in other places. So this is really the demand side of the story. And is that part of the story? It certainly is. But there's more to it. We also need to think about the supply side. How much housing do we have? So I know it's Monday and I'm throwing Greek letters at you, which for some of you might elicit some traumatic previous experience. But this is the only economics I'm going to talk about here, which is elasticity, which is a really important concept in the field of economics. The idea of elasticity is when the price of a good changes, suppliers will respond. Might respond by building a lot or producing a lot or not. So if these clickers go up and become $100,000 tonight, what's going to happen tomorrow? Whoever makes these clickers is going to make a whole bunch of them. We're going to run 2 shifts, 3 shifts, et cetera. So it would be pretty elastic supply, meaning we would see a supply response very, very quickly. If the price of houses goes up 5 times tonight, what happens tomorrow? Nothing. We can't build housing in a day. Right? So generally speaking, housing is going to be more inelastic than clickers. Okay? But we also know from city to city that there's big variation in the supply response. Some places will respond to population growth and price increases more quickly, and other places won't. Okay? And urban economists have done this work to demonstrate that the regulatory environment in a city and the topography of that city have a big impact on supply elasticity. If you have mountains and water and strict regulations, San Francisco, you're going to have a very inelastic housing supply. A friend just sent me a tweet last week. The average time to get a housing permit in San Francisco right now is 700 days. People are dying in the streets and it's taking us 700 days to build housing. Now, this doesn't mean regulations are bad. You shouldn't walk out here and say, Greg hates regulations. Like, I want my ground beef to be safe, right? I want housing to be safe. But there is a line between reasonable regulation and 700 days to build housing in the midst of a housing crisis. Okay? And so what we want to understand then is the relationship between the demand for housing, which is change in population, and the supply of housing as measured by supply elasticity. 1 is kind of the neutral point for elasticity. Above 1 would mean you build a lot of housing when prices go up. Below 1 would be inelastic, meaning you don't build housing when prices go up. So this Sunbelt quadrant is really interesting to me. They've had rapid population growth, but because of very elastic housing supply, they've been able to maintain, these are vacancy rates, relatively high vacancy rates and more affordable, not affordable, but more affordable housing than our coastal cities. Now, you might say they've done this through sprawl. Yes, they have, right? And this is probably not the model we want as a nation to adopt in terms of the housing supply, the way we would respond. But the point is that they have responded. This is the perfect storm for a housing crisis. And so while tragic, it should not surprise anyone. You layer a boom, a tech, an innovation boom on these cities, and you don't build any housing, what happens? You end up with really low vacancy rates, you end up with really high prices, you end up with a homelessness crisis. Tragic, but absolutely foreseeable. What really frustrates me about my city is we had a 10 or 15-year head start. We watched what happened in San Francisco and didn't do a damn thing. And so when I'm traveling around, what's been fun about this is I go to some big cities like Boston, but I've been to Boise, I've been to Phoenix, and I've been to Houston, and I'm going to Indianapolis, and I'm going to Charlotte. And I can say, I'm like the ghost of Christmas to come. Don't do what we did. You're growing quickly, and if you put your head in the sand, you're going to end up where we are. And once you're here, it's a heck of a lot harder to get out of it. So it's fun in Boise because Boise's rents went bananas during COVID because people left the Bay Area and they were freaking out. And we left and the mayor's like, we have to build more housing. I was like, yeah, you do. So, you know, there are lessons to be learned here. And the problem is that as a nation, throughout our history, we tend to make policy in times of crisis and we wait for a crisis to do things. All of our big social policies happen during wars or depressions or pandemics. I'm hoping that other cities around the nation will not wait until you get to be in a state of crisis before we act. So if you buy the argument, you don't have to buy the argument. If you buy the argument, I would say a couple things. One is we have invested as a nation a lot of money into the homelessness response system, and that's great. It's life-saving. I think we have a moral and ethical obligation to do so. But we're fooling ourselves if we think the crisis response system is in any way going to end the crisis. It's not intervening upstream, it is a response to the crisis. That should be continued. We need to intervene upstream and thinking about all forms of housing. Yes, we need capital investments to make sure that we can construct housing. Do we need private developers to build market rate housing? Absolutely, because we need way more of that in San Francisco and Seattle and Boston. Will that alone end homelessness? Absolutely not. We also need to think about public sources of funding, nonprofit and public sources of funding to construct housing for people who have lower incomes. It's just a reality. So people, I do a lot of talks. So I was an investment banker. And so people have said, well, you're a socialist now. I'm like, I'm not a socialist. I'm just saying there's a role for the government in the provision of housing. There is no way, and I've had developers get so mad at me. I said, how are you going to build market rate housing that's affordable to someone working for $15 an hour, which is the Seattle minimum wage? It doesn't work. Land costs, construction costs, all that, it just, the math doesn't work. That's not a capitalism or socialism. There's no normative statement there at all, other than it just doesn't work. And we can stick our head in the sands and just deal with the consequences, which is what we're doing now, or we can just say there might be another way to do it. And then the other thing that we need to really think about from a regulatory standpoint is where housing is difficult to construct. We need to think about our land use. We cannot, 75% of parcels in Seattle are zoned single family. People are walking from their single family homes to go to an NHL Major League Hockey game. Name another city in the world outside the United States where you can live in single family housing and walk to a major sporting event and a major basketball game. It doesn't work. I understand why you like it. It's a pretty good deal, but it doesn't work. It doesn't work. So what makes this really hard, and why I always say to elected leaders, especially on the West Coast, this is an incredibly difficult job, is the solutions to this crisis are long-term in nature, and we have a short-term crisis that's raging. And voters are demanding that we fix the unsheltered chronic homeless crisis in these cities. And so because building housing takes a long time, then the question is, what do we do in the interim? Should we have a more robust shelter system? Probably. But I'm also reluctant to build New York 2.0. That's an incredibly costly system, and doesn't produce great outcomes for individuals. Which is why failure to resolve this are going to end up with criminalization moves. What I've said on National Alliance to Homelessness calls, research calls, is what I'm more worried about is the fact that in my social circle in Seattle, many of whom are Obama, Biden voters, are saying, get these people out of here. I'm not really worried about conservative efforts to undermine housing first. I'm worried about people who consider themselves to be reasonably compassionate people saying, I can't handle this anymore. This guy is urinating in front of my storefront every day. I can't handle it. Get him out of here. And that's where we're going in our left-leaning, progressive, compassionate cities. And that's a real concern. Who's responsible for this, public or private? I think the answer is both. And then if you do believe there's a public role, whose responsibility is this? The federal government, state, local? Right, those are tricky questions. So to wrap up here, what I'm hoping to leave you with today is that this is a structural problem. If we continue to blame individuals for the outcomes that they achieve, it will undermine our effectiveness, because if we can blame Joe on the street and not look in the mirror and say, this is something that we have created as a community, that I, Greg, have contributed to this, then we can absolve ourselves of responsibility. Structural problems require structural solutions. And people say, well, fine, Greg, you've got these fancy graphs, but how do you know housing's going to end homelessness? Because we've done it. We cut veteran homelessness in the United States by 50% over a decade. Why? Because leaders of both political parties said we didn't want people coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan to experience homelessness at the same rates that the Vietnam generation did. So what do? We gave them housing. In some cases, it was housing with supportive services. In some cases, it was a voucher. And we cut it by 50%. That's a huge reduction. We know it works. The question is, will we extend that logic more broadly? And that's a question of politics and political will and resource allocation, et cetera. That's my story. Thank you for listening. Appreciate it.
Great. Thank you very much, Greg. Really a lot to think about. And again, one of the things I like the best about your book is that you, I think as someone who's done research, has sometimes failed to kind of message it and share it in a way that's accessible and that can actually drive impact. So just really deeply appreciative to you for taking up that mantle and writing a book that I think is accessible to everyone and tells a really clear and compelling story about this problem. So just really appreciate it. And I was reflecting, I think we first connected in the summer months of the pandemic when we were in the stages of writing this book, and I think I was pushing an infant around my neighborhood. Now I'm dropping him off at daycare. He's almost 3, and he's just screaming for me to play Wheels on the Bus on the way. So, but I'm just thrilled that you're here, and thank you.
Well, I appreciate your help and support. You were really helpful as I wrote this.
And so I'm really delighted to have a really excellent group of panelists here who I'm hoping are going to share their perspectives on the problem of homelessness. And hopefully a little bit about what we do with it. So what we do about it, so that we can have a little bit of a solutions focused conversation as well. So I'll introduce the panelists here, have a couple of questions for them, and then also hope to engage some of the folks here in attendance with the questions that you have as well. So I'll just start to my right here with Linda Downey, who is the president and executive director of the Pine Street Inn, which provides permanent housing, job training and placement, emergency shelter, and street outreach to more than 2,000 individuals each day here in Boston. Lindy has worked with Pine Street Inn for her entire career, over 35 years, and has served in her current role since the year 2000. As a result of her leadership and vision, Pine Street is now the largest provider of permanent supportive housing for men and women moving out of homelessness in New England, with 850 units of housing. To her right is Cecil Townsend. Cecil is going to be sharing his expertise with us today as a person with lived experience of homelessness. Cecil wanted me to share that he is a lifelong Bostonian, having grown up in the Roxbury and Dorchester neighborhoods of Boston. He served in the Marine Corps, having done some training in North and South Carolina, and is also an artist. He was sharing with a number of our panelists some of the really wonderful artwork that he's done. And he's got, and so we're really excited to have Cecil here to share his perspective as well. To his right is Nikki Barfield, who's the acting director of the Supportive Services for Veteran Families program at the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs. The SSVF program provides case management and supportive services to prevent the imminent loss of a veteran's home or identify a new, more suitable housing situation for the individual and his or her family, or to rapidly rehouse veterans and their families who are homeless and might remain homeless without this assistance. And Nikki is a licensed clinical social worker, which is a point of pride for me, being someone who's on the faculty at the Boston University School of Social Work here. So really excited to have you here, Nikki. I wanted to, I have a few questions for each of you that I'm hoping that we could just do sort of a little bit of a round robin to start here. And Lydia, just since you're here to my right, we'll start with you. I'd be curious just to hear a little bit more about kind of what Pine Street does and how you work to address homelessness in Boston. And really, I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on some of what Gregg shared, sort of about kind of the extent to which housing markets conditions really place constraints on the work that you do and your ability to be effective, and how you think that might have changed over time as well, what you've seen over the course of your career.
Well, I certainly think, thanks, Tom, and really nice to be here. The book was terrific. It's nice to see it laid out so clearly with data saying this is about housing. And here's what I'd say. You know, Pine Street really is a bit of a soup to nuts organization. We do street outreach, we build and sometimes manage or build with partners permanent supportive housing. And in between that, we provide shelter. We have a catering company where we employ homeless people. We have a homeless court, and we work really hard when people come into shelter to get them out of shelter, like immediately if we can. Can't always do that. Probably the thing that people don't know about Pine Street is we're right now probably the largest provider of permanent supportive housing for chronically homeless people, probably in New England. We've got 850 units, and we've got over 250 in the pipeline that will be live sometime within the next some units literally next month, and then another 100 units in about a year. We're trying with a partner to buy a hotel in Dorchester to convert it to housing. And how can I say this? We do not do a good job with supply. We've got permitting issues in Boston, and I'm going to give you one example of permitting nightmares. We have had an infusion of people who can afford much higher rents and much higher purchasing prices, and we never said, what about people who can't anymore? And how do we not just build that housing new, how do we not lose it? Because every single day we are losing affordable units to condo conversion or much high-end conversions that people who are homeless can't afford. And I want to talk about the permitting for a minute, because you can all imagine what it's like for me and some of our team. We go out to a neighborhood and I say, hi, I'm from Pine Street Inn. We'd like to build housing in your neighborhood. And everybody says, oh, I'm so glad you're here. This is great. Not everybody says, we don't want you in our neighborhood. We don't want these people here. Who do you think you are? And go home. And I do think this, to Gregg's point, this is fundamentally about what we think of homeless people and the stigma and what we've allowed to happen, which is these people don't belong here. You've been from Boston all your life. You're not coming back, and you're not going to live in my neighborhood, and you're not going to be my neighbor. That to me is the root of our problem here. And it's not just Boston, because in order to permit in Boston, you need zoning relief. And to get zoning relief, you need your neighbors, your neighborhood associations, you need your elected officials to stand up and say, we'll support this project, because in front of the zoning board, that is what the zoning board is going to look like, is going to ask for. And it's really, really hard to do. We've been doing development a long time, and sometimes we are the developer. We buy a building, we redevelop it, we put the funding together. More recently, we're not a developer. We're working with partners like community builders or big communities. They're buying the building, they're renovating it, and we're coming in and providing support services for people. But the building Cecil lives in is one of the unique buildings that we have. So we bought it maybe 15, 20 years ago. I'm trying to think now. It's been a while. It was an as-of-right building. I think in my career at Pine Street, I've come across 2 as-of-right buildings in my entire time developing housing, which meant we did not need zoning relief. It was permitted as a lodging house. It had a lodging house license. It was an as-of-right. It came on the market. We knew it was coming on the market. Another nonprofit owned it. There had been a fire. The building was vacant. We were working with Trinity Church at the time here in the Back Bay on some housing, and the building came up for sale. And I went to our board and I said, listen, this thing is a steal. It's a really good price. There's no permitting. We don't have to go to anybody, not a single person to get permitted. We came up with we had someone leave us some money that year in a bequest. We used that bequest. Trinity Church gave us the rest of the purchase price. They loaned us money at 0%. We bought the building. Needed some work. We had tenants in that building within 3 months of purchase. So a hotel in Dorchester, we've been talking to the city about it for over a year. It's going to require at least a year of construction. And that's assuming, by the way, we can get permitted, which is not a given. So when I tell you the difference between an as of right, which in my opinion, we need as of right stuff in cities like Boston and Seattle, where you want to go in and build, okay, maybe not 200 units would be as of right, supportive housing should be as of right, affordable housing should be as of right, because we are so tied up in the fights about who gets to live in my neighborhood that as of right isn't even on the table. And years ago, we had a lot more as of right in Boston. We've made it really, really complicated. We're not the only ones. San Francisco has. The one other thing I'll say is, we work only with individuals, so we do not work with families. Different subject for a minute, it's not our area of expertise. But despite our very high market, and it is a horribly expensive market with very low vacancy rate, we have a very low street count in Boston. We hover between 2 and 3% versus probably Seattle's around 45%. What's that about? We have a much more robust shelter system, not about the weather, by the way. People think it is. But the other thing I will say is if you pull out families, so when Gregg did his research, families and individuals were counted together. If you pull out families in Boston, which are typically double the number of individuals, our individual number looks decent. Why? My only explanation for that is we as a city have tried very hard to keep the pedal on the gas around supportive housing. And supportive housing is for folks that need support and affordable housing. And if we keep doing that and we keep building and targeting it the same way we did for vets, targeted to the people who we know need it, that really does seem to have some.
Great, thank you very much. Cecil, I'll turn to you. Just curious to hear kind of any thoughts that you have about what Gregg said, but also would love to hear some of what your experiences are as a person trying to find and maintain housing in Boston and how it came to be that you're living where you are now in a building operated by Pine Street.
Okay. I used to live with my sister Margaret, and I lived it like just for all my life. I was working a job. My problem was marijuana, smoking weed, and I love smoking weed. And I was working. I always held down a job, but the weed kind of made me lazy. At one point, I didn't really, you work, you come, you tired, and the break was smoking weed, and every year, my sister, I paid her rent, and as long as I paid her rent, everything was fine. As long, helping out, was fine. But every year, it got okay. I had like a job for a year. Then the next, I left the job. Then the next time I got a job, it was for 9 months. And the next job, it got less and less. And the marijuana was making me lazy. I didn't want to do anything. And when I found myself homeless, and my sister was nice. She gave me a lot of chance, get a job, blah, 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 keep the job and all this, And I agreed with her, but at one point you get to the point where you don't care because of the smoking marijuana. The marijuana was like a award for working. You work hard. I used to work at a Star Market on Bolton Street. I was a cashier and I was a bagger, and I loved the job. And people always compliment me, you're a good worker, and all that. And I worked hard. And the smoking was a break. You get home, it's a break. It's a reward, for working hard. Then and after it got less and less me working, and then my sister said, you gotta go. And I remember the day too, she let me go. She kicked me out. 2008, when Obama got elected. Either he got elected or he was and he actually went into office. But I think it was 2008. I will always remember that day. I found myself at Pine Street. And Pine Street was very familiar because when I used to go to work, I used to pass by Pine Street. And it's like a symbol. Pine Street's like, it's been around forever. It seemed like it's been around forever, the tower. And when I found myself on Pine Street, I was terrified. I went in there, I remember Pine Street had a little room, big room, TV room. And some people, and they got benches, some people be laying on the floor. Some people got the benches watching the TV. At one point, I was sitting on the floor, I was reading the Bible, terrified, you know, what's going to become of me. And I read a scripture, it was Psalm 98, Psalm 91, and it mentioned the Lord being our shelter. And I was thinking, I'm in a shelter, but it says the Lord be my, you know, be the shelter. So from that point on, I felt comforted in thinking, okay, let me just trust in God, and I'm in a shelter. Let me make Him my shelter. You know, read the Bible, get encouragement from, you know, and He'll work it out. Pine Street helped me a lot. People told me it's a what do you call it, like a stepping stone. It actually is. There was people at Pine Street that didn't care, and they just took it as a shelter. But there was programs and opportunity there that helped me to get where I am now. Where I am now, I'm at 459 Park Drive. I think it's a nice neighborhood. I've been there for 11 years. I got there 2011, and this past June 29th, I've been there 11 years. And the years, I don't know if y'all know this, the older you get, the quicker time goes by. the years flew by, boom, 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 boom. 11 years. I remember the day I got there. And it's like, wow, you know. And all this is before COVID, you know, and I was even in some newsletters from Pine Street, and they had one newsletter that says stopping homelessness, one person at a time, something like that. And it's true, and I look and it shows me, and I'm smiling and all this stuff. And I'm not saying the place is paradise, but it's better than being out in the street. And I've seen people out in the street from Pine Street. Well, I say from Pine Street because Pine Street has this gray blanket, and there's people out there with their gray blanket. And I'd rather be at Pine Street than wrapped in a gray blanket, you know, in some park benches and all that. And I never really slept outside. I slept outside once, and because the time, there's a time you got to be in there. If you're not there at that certain time, you know, at Pine Street, if you're not there at a certain time, you can't get a bed. And every night people be trying to get a bed. One particular night I didn't make it, and I found myself outside. It was during the summertime. It was in that band though, but it felt creepy. I never slept outside before. It didn't feel right. And I just appreciate shelters like Pine Street. And at Pine Street, man, I met people from all over the world.
Mm-hmm.
I met there was one guy, he was from Russia, and he was telling me different stuff how Russia is. And this is a shelter. This isn't the UN. This is a shelter. And I met people from New York and Florida, California, and people, a lot of people come to Boston because we got one of the best system of shelters or something. Because a lot of them told me where I come from, we don't got a lot of shelters. You can't sleep outside. California, I'd be thinking that's a, you know, sleeping outside would be wonderful. Cops used to, one guy told me cops used to, sometimes the cops bother them, but sometimes the cops put them in jail just to get them off the street. And there ain't a lot of shelters. I heard the same thing about New York. And New York's a big city. My mom came from New York, the big city. They talk about how bad it is in New York, and everybody seemed to come to Boston or Massachusetts because it had better, you know, system dealing with homelessness. But I still see homeless people around, and it makes me thankful. It makes me thankful that there's shelters like Pine Street, and I'm in the process, and it seems like a long process, but I'm in the process where I'm moving on from homelessness, and I'm asked a lot by Pine Street to tell my story, and I appreciate. I would like to tell my story. I'm glad I'm here.
Yeah. Well, thank you for sharing that with us. In a couple minutes, I'm going to ask folks more thoughts about helping other people. So I'll be curious to hear your thoughts on that, about what you might tell the mayor or the governor. But I want to hear also give Nikki an opportunity to share a few things as well. And Nikki, I've heard people tell me that that SSVF is the greatest thing since sliced bread, but I feel it's as though it's a program that flies very much under the radar in terms of its impact and what it's how important it's been in efforts to address homelessness among veterans. So I'd be curious just to hear from you briefly, sort of to share with folks what SSVF does, and in particular, there's an interesting thing that SSVF has introduced more recently, this shallow subsidy program that I think is potentially an interesting thing when we talk about high cost cities, and just kind of curious about that, but also just more broadly your perspective as someone who's the director of a national program and working across these different geographies, and what you're hearing about challenges in different settings. So I know I've thrown a lot at you there, but take any of those pieces that you'd like.
You're happy to, and thank you so much for having me. I actually appreciate hearing your presentation, so we'd love to connect. But how many of you guys are familiar with the VA, just by show of hands, just so I know that? Okay. So as Gregg mentioned, and I do appreciate the acknowledgement, VA has actually been working on this homeless issue among veterans for a couple of decades. And as I acknowledge, as Gregg had mentioned, we are a well-funded program. When you talk about homelessness and you talk about veterans, there's no Republican, there's no Democrat who wants to be against that. So as a result, we are well-funded. We've had an opportunity in the VA to try different things to get us to where we reduce homelessness by at least half. My particular program, the SSVF program, Supportive Services for Veterans Families program, actually started in 2011. Around the time Cecil actually first got his start to permanent housing. It is actually, the mission of it is really to look at rapidly rehousing and preventing veteran homelessness. A fun fact about the SSVF program is it actually is the first VA program designed to serve veterans and their families. And when we talk about veterans' families, typically when you look at government programs, you're looking at legal definition. You have to be married, you have to prove this, you have to prove that. Our SSVF program, the veterans actually don't have to prove that. It's who they identify as their family. So if they have this long-term partner that they say, this is my family, then that's who we also serve. That's unique to our SSVF program. We started in 2011, looking at rapidly housing, preventing veterans, and how do we do that? So we rely on our community partners. VA's mission really is healthcare. Our mission is healthcare. When you look at the federal government, we are charged with providing healthcare. HUD is charged with providing housing. So a lot of times when we think about the VA, and we'll talk about veteran housing, it really is a collaboration with a lot of our partners. So the early years of the homelessness was looking at our permanent supportive housing program, our HUD Dash program, which is a collaboration with HUD. VA provides supportive housing, HUD provides the housing voucher for those individuals. We have our grant per diem program, which is more of transitional housing program. And then now we have SSVF, which serves the veteran and families. SSVF doesn't provide direct housing. What we do in SSVF is we provide case management services, outreach services, housing navigation services, and then many times funding, temporary funding to help veterans and their families either maintain their housing so they don't end up in a homeless situation or move a transition to permanent. So SSVF is a very robust program. We do this through a competitive grant process once a year. We receive our funding. We put out a NOFA, notice of funding available. Nonprofit organizations compete for the funding. We provide the award for the funding, and we support the program for the duration of their funding. So just to give you an idea of what our budget looks like this fiscal year, our budget is a little over $750 million. That's $750 million that we're giving to nonprofit organizations to administer our SSVF program. We currently have about 260 grantees located all over the country, and we expect them again to provide outreach, to provide case management, housing navigation, whatever it's going to take to help that veteran and their family from moving into a homeless situation or from moving out of a homeless situation into permanent housing. You want me to talk about shallow subsidy right now?
Yeah, really quickly about
Okay.
shallow subsidy, and then also maybe your perspective, kind of what you're seeing, because SSVF is everywhere in the country. So anything that you're seeing in
Yeah.
Gregg's book about regional differences, what do you see
Yeah.
from your perspective as national directors, challenges in different places?
So SSVF started in 2011. And one of the things that I appreciate that Gregg mentioned is, he's the ghost of the present, right? Like everybody could see this coming, where the original director of the program, John Poon, is a visionary. He's a visionary. And I think he saw it coming. I think he saw it coming, and he wanted to get in front of it. So he brought to our SSVF program a service. It's not a separate program, but a specific service called shallow subsidy. Shallow subsidy is not unique to the VA, but it is a financial investment. And I'll share with you a little bit about what shallow subsidy is in a second. So there are other communities that also provide the shallow subsidy, but what the shallow subsidy does is it helps leverage a veteran and their family's financial situation to compete in these extremely tight job markets. Most of our veterans and their families, as well as most homeless individuals, they have a stagnant income. The only income changes they're going to get are cost of living increases that come along. When you have that compared to someone who makes double that amount of income in a tight housing market, low vacancy, it's just really hard to compete with that fixed income. What shallow subsidy does is it provides, our SSVF grantees provide a 2-year commitment to that veteran and family to provide up to 50% of their rental assistance during that time. This program actually started off in 2019 as a pilot in 11 high-cost, low vacancy communities. Boston was not one of them at that time, but we did expand the shallow subsidy program in August of 2021 to all communities. So all of our SSVF grantees have the opportunity to use shallow subsidies to help veterans and their families leverage things as they look for permanent housing. Those individuals who receive shallow subsidies or grantees provide very light case management services. We're talking about veterans and their families who really just need a hand up. They don't have the typical things you hear about homelessness, the substance use disorder, the mental health issues. They're just poor. They're just poor. They can't compete in their housing market, and to be asking people to leave their communities, just so they can find affordable housing really is a disservice. So shallow subsidy is kind of the VA's way to be able to help those veterans and their families leverage permanent housing.
Great, thanks. And Gregg, I'll conclude, and this may be a transition where thinking forward in solutions. So, you have mentioned you're the go Christmas future and encouraging cities to be forward thinking. I think about Boston as kind of in that same place when we're talking about hiring new faculty to BU. I get asked a lot about kind of the cost of housing, and I say that we're not San Francisco yet. Right. So I kind of have a 2-part question for you. One, and in the book and in here, you kind of talk about the tension between federal versus local responsibility. So I'm curious to your thoughts on kind of what is it that should be the federal versus the local role? And also, if we're Boston, what from your perspective, what should we be doing? Is it zoning reform? What exactly is it?
Yeah. So when we talk about the policy responses, the problem is like it can be a little bit of a fantasy land discussion. And so I'll tell you like what I think should happen, and then we can talk about what actually is going to happen. So I met with the governor of Washington last Friday, and I just said, and he's got a $4 billion housing proposal, bonding proposal, which I'm very supportive of. And I said, we need to understand the policy context that produced this challenge, which is 1 in 5 people who are eligible for housing support from the federal government actually receive it. So if you're eligible for food support in the United States, you get it. SNAP is an entitlement if you are eligible. And so what happens is for the 4 in 5 people who do not get federal support, those issues are pushed down to the state of Massachusetts, the state of Boston, King County, Seattle, et cetera. And because it's the biggest line item in the household budget, that is a huge nut for states and local jurisdictions to handle. So my dream scenario is, well, not the full dream scenario. I'm actually a big supporter of public housing. I don't think that's going to happen. I think the most likely federal action would be an expansion of the voucher program. It's not a silver bullet, and I have some issues with the voucher program, but it's far more likely than public housing. And if we did expand voucher capacity at the federal level, what that does for local jurisdictions is we then have to worry less about the purchasing power of individual households because that's going to come from the voucher. And then we can really think about the supply side. And LIHTC, which is our tax credit program, which is the primary method we use to build affordable housing. I sit on the board of a LIHTC developer in Seattle. It's a heck of a lot easier if you have vouchers in there because the rents are up and the math works a lot easier. So if you can pair federal support for vouchers with a local commitment to construct housing, and you know that people are going to have vouchers and pay market rents, you can start to expand your housing stock. And the way that you build the housing stock locally and at the state level is land use. And so I always reference Catherine's book because the problem is that local jurisdictions are saying, I don't want density. And density is absolutely essential to this, to increasing the housing capacity. It's absolutely essential. And so that's why I'm really excited about state level actions to basically say, be somewhat paternalistic and say, well, children, meaning cities, you've screwed this up for generation after generation. We're going to step in now and basically say you have to have different land use. So that's not fantasy land, but it's still a little bit fantasy land because we tried to build back better and then we didn't get vouchers. And so now we're basically stuck with the state of Washington doing a $4 billion, which is that's a big number, for state level money for housing because we're not getting it from the feds.
So before we open it up, and because I'm curious, other folks as well, I think I would ask folks maybe just really quickly in 30 seconds, each of our panelists, if there's one thing that, and Greg, it sounds like you do already have the ear of the governor, but if there's one thing that, if you had the ear of the mayor, the governor, what would be sort of the one thing that you would want folks to know about homelessness and what to do about it?
It's a housing problem. It's a supply problem.
Cecil, if you could tell the mayor, the governor, the president, one thing that you would want them to know about homelessness and your experiences and solutions.
We need it. We need it.
Thanks.
So I feel like I have their attention. We are, the VA is very well resourced. And I appreciate it. I will say the one challenge that we have had with the shallow subsidy program, while it sounds golden, it's great, is the pandemic. The pandemic has been hard for everyone. We recognize that. When the pandemic first happened, and I know this is more than 30 seconds, but I think it's important that they know this. When the pandemic first happened, it was devastating, and there was the VA received, probably other nonprofits received a whole lot of extra funding, CARES funding, ARC funding to do just different unique things, which was great, right? So we expanded and we did all these great things. We expanded shallow subsidy to everybody to do, but at the same time, there was things called the Stafford Act, and the Stafford Act is basically the federal declaration that there's an emergency. And when you have a Stafford Act, that's great because it handles whatever you need to do without regulations. But the drawback is there was no need to do shallow subsidy. Why do shallow subsidy? Why offer this 2-year commitment when I can do everything under the Stafford Act and I don't need to do it? So there was no focus on it, right? So now my program has all this money to expand the shallow subsidy program nationally. Nobody wants to use it because they can do more. They can do more with the Stafford Act. May 11th, the Stafford Act ends. The Stafford Act ends May 11th. So starting May 12th, I fully expect we're going to be tapping into the shallow subsidy more to be able to expand it. So I kind of already have their attention between, with the funding and things that we're doing. But sadly, I'm glad that we're able to move from the pandemic so we could start using some of these resources. So when I go to Congress for future years, we can right size our program with the amount of funding that we need. It's not based solely on the pandemic.
And Greg, if there's
I would
anything else.
say this is a crisis and it deserves a crisis response.
Yeah.
I have a friend in Seattle who was heavily involved in the housing response to Katrina in the Gulf. And he actually said in a meeting, he said, do you know that if we have an earthquake in Seattle, FEMA is ready to basically put up almost 100,000 housing units to house people in the event of an earthquake. And those are sitting somewhere, you know, within a couple hour drive of Seattle. And these are housing units. And so why is it that we're prepared to house people in a natural disaster, but we aren't in an economic disaster?
Thanks. All right, well, thank you to all of our panelists. At this time, I would welcome any questions if the folks in attendance have. Want to open it up for conversation and questions. We'll start maybe in the back with you, sir, and then.
My name is Dana Mendez. I'm the director of Youth and Young Adult Homelessness Initiatives for the Mayor's Office of Human Services. And one of the things that you talked about briefly in your slide was that, you know, race doesn't make someone homeless, but racism does, right? And I'm interested in thinking about how system levels of oppression, right, against people of color, people with disabilities, young people, elderly, affect their access to housing, even when there is housing, right? So I went to college in 2009, came back in 2013. All this new housing had come up in the city of Boston, right? Hundreds and hundreds of units. Beautiful units all over the city, and people still can't afford to live there, right? And so while we think about housing as, you know, the housing market, right, the physical places that we put people, yes, we know that that's an issue, but thinking about why that is, right, like why is that the issue, right? Like, and this is something that I think we can find throughout history, that when you do focus on select small groups, right, you can make an impact that make it seem like things are happening much more quickly or much more effectively than they actually are, right? When we think about veterans, think about chronic homelessness, and now I think that there's kind of a focus on like youth homelessness, right? It's a hot thing to talk about, but really, if you're not looking at much larger systems, right, that are keeping these things in place, zoning, right, we're thinking about relationship to access to resources, then how can we expect that any of these new housing that we, let's say we did create, how do we expect that to go to the people who are most vulnerable and need it most when systems are still designed to keep people there, right? So I'm just interested in you all's perspective on that.
Good question. You want me to start?
Please.
I can talk about it from the veterans' perspective that, you know, when we first started this, again, we've been doing this for a couple decades, tackling the Indian homelessness pandemic and the problems that have it. But when we first started, I'll admit VA is the guinea pig. Like, because again, no one wants to say no to homeless veterans. So a lot of the funding that we get, we tried all these different things. Some work, some don't work, with hopes that it will spread to the other populations, the youth, the families, the veterans, so on and so forth. I can tell you specifically for our SSPF program, one of the things that we looked at with the data is exactly what Greg said, and exactly what you mentioned. The amount of services and the people who are receiving the services are not equivalent to the racial demographics that we see. So what we've done is we've required our grantee, but we've always said it. We've required them to really look community level to make sure that the services are being provided equally. But we're actually now providing them their specific data that shows where they are, especially as it relates to race, and asking for them to provide community level action plans on how they're going to make changes to make sure that the services are going to those that are more at risk. So we've done that before. Honestly, like, we give them an Excel spreadsheet that you just can't even read, and I'm not going to be bothered with it. So we've asked our staff to revamp that to make it in a more data presentable way. So when we ask them to provide us with their action plans, we can expect more because we know that they can understand the data. So that has been an area that VA has been focusing.
I would just add, you know, and I talk about this many times in my talks, you could write a book that says homelessness is a racial justice issue, and we should write that book, right? It absolutely is. We could write a book that says this is an economic inequality issue. The way we have structured capitalism in the United States has produced this crisis. So this is not the only framing. There are multiple lenses, structural lenses that we could use to look at this. I teach a housing class, and I say to my students, if you want to understand racial disparity in the United States, looking at it through a housing lens is a really effective way to do that, right? And are we going to fix that after we have 400 years of this legacy? That's a lot of work, right? And we're going to fix that today? Probably not, unfortunately. But that's essential. And so I actually debated about whether I should call this book a structural problem, but I study housing and ultimately decided to frame it around housing. We can argue whether that was the right decision or not, but I think you're absolutely right. And I do think that these structural impediments, I always think about, I was doing the point in time count survey in Minneapolis. Yeah, you walk around in the middle of the night, January, it's cold. And I did interviews of youth in a youth shelter. I interviewed 5 young people, 4 of whom identified as GLBTQ, and all 4 of them said, under no circumstances would I be welcome home. So.
It's real. Yes, it's real.
I think we had a question here, and then I'll go here. So
Hi, I'm Sharon, and I actually am a recovering land use planner from San Francisco. I also worked in commercial real estate and ran a nonprofit building homeless housing, interim homeless housing. Hopefully, quick 2-part question. One is, talking about San Francisco's vacancy rates, I'm curious how it compares to other markets, especially Boston. Last year, the budget analyst office actually did an estimation of San Francisco's market vacancy, which is around 60,000 units, multiple times over the unsheltered homelessness count. Within PSH, there's actually a pretty sustained, close to 1,000 average units of vacancy, which is about 10% of the PSH stock. Just curious how that factors into your book's analysis about that, and how does that compare to Boston's vacancy? Second part is, looking at Vermont's example as a state with state level zoning control, where the problem of supply is actually at the state level, where local municipalities actually want the housing production, want the density. As we're looking at shifting the balance of power towards the state versus local authority, how do we prevent a situation like Vermont from replicating in a place like California? Thank you.
Well, I'll take the first one. We actually break down the San Francisco vacancies in the book, because there have been all these stories written. There are X number of vacancies in San Francisco, and it's 4 times the homeless population. Why do we have a homeless problem? So, so that is a resource if you're so interested. The point here is that 5% vacancy is like the natural level of vacancy. It's like unemployment. You can't get to 0 because Tom leaves his job and that seat's going to be empty for a little while, and you have this friction. That's true in the housing market as well. And so in a big city, you do have a lot of empty units. But if you are below 5%, economists would suggest that you have a deficit of housing. And so 3-4%, which is where Seattle, San Francisco, Boston are operating, you have an insufficient supply of housing, even though you do have vacancies. And so it's a common narrative, and one that we struggle to counter a little bit, because people just do the basic math, and in fact that's not accurate. And so I'm always very clear to say, your vacancy is 4%, you have a deficit of housing. And in terms of shelter beds and PSH, again, you've got this cycling, and so it's very hard to have every bed. And I don't operate housing every day like other people do, but it's almost impossible to have those beds occupied every night. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't try to improve our allocation and the efficiency of the system. Absolutely, absolutely. But I am pretty firmly opposed to the idea that this is an inefficient system that we're just letting vacant beds sit around. That's not been my experience.
Yeah, and just a comment, we track our vacancies. I haven't looked recently at the city in permanent supportive housing. We run between 6 and 7%, which is higher than I like. It's not because we don't have people ready for the unit. It's because the step button who is really in charge of all of our work with the city. And to Dana's point, this is a systems issue. How do you make a unit available and move people in quickly when you have HUD, you have inspections, you have regulatory issues, sometimes at city levels, sometimes at the HUD level. I will tell you, during COVID, our vacancy rate ironically went up because we couldn't get inspectors to come out and inspect the units, and we can't inspect our own units. And so we were every day calling the subsidy provider, where's the inspector? So some of these system things that really are messy could be streamlined. I don't disagree with that. That doesn't, to Greg's point though, until we get enough supply, we can't really have the argument about, you know, is this just it is an inefficient system. I have no argument with that whatsoever. Could we streamline it? Yeah. The thing that has streamlined housing in Boston the most for chronic folks is Housing First, where we can mitigate queries up front. We can go up front to the housing authority and say, we think this person would be a good tenant. Here's the 5 reasons why, and we'll testify to that. So there's things we've done to try and mitigate the length of time. Some have been effective and some have not.
I'm just gonna add, you know, with the pandemic funding, and actually HUD received a lot of funding too nationally. And there was an abundance of housing vouchers that are not just for veterans, but for anybody that actually came out, which sounds like a really good thing. But when you're in these low vacancy communities, like my individual that I got here who has a fixed income that's below AMI, and then you got the landlord who at this point is want money, right? So they're not prioritizing my little person here. We can leverage the whole he served his country thing, but you know that only goes so far when we talk about money. So you know when we talk about expanding these housing, and we got to target and we got to dedicate it to the people who really need it. If not, it's going to come into the crunch with everyone else, and it's not going to go to the people who need it.
And I'll just say something here that I often think about based on what you just said, Nikki, right? The reality is, as Greg was saying, you know, less than 1 in 5 people in this country who are eligible for federal housing assistance actually get it, which means that the majority of people who are exiting homelessness are going to do it to private market housing. And we don't talk about that a lot and the role that landlords play. There's some stuff the VA does, the city has done some landlord mitigation stuff. So that's a whole other can of worms, but I just would put it in there because most people are going to exit the private market housing rented by private land. So there's 2 questions. I'll go. I kind of messed up my order. I think I said this gentleman in the back, and then we'll go to in the second row, and then the third row. Thank you. Thank you for your generosity and feeding the.
I'll be quick. My name's Adam. I also work for the mayor's office of housing, working on permanent supportive housing. Just a quick question. I was wondering if there's any historical examples of housing elasticity, like cities booms in the 1920s. Is there evidence that it was much easier to build housing then, and whether this story sort of has a can sort of go back in time at all?
That's a good question. I actually haven't looked into that. There's people always ask me, like, give me the story of a really inelastic city that's changed. I was like, there isn't one. You know, I wish there's. Now, I can't speak to history because I haven't done that, but kind of in the modern era of homelessness, 1980s, like we don't have a good example of a city that has basically said, we're going to do this and kind of change in terms of radically increasing their housing supply. So I'm going to dodge your question. I will say though that there is big variation though. Seattle has done a heck of a lot better job than San Francisco has meaningfully. And so while I am very critical of my own city, we've done way better. Now, San Francisco has really underperformed, you know, when you look at growth and housing production. So there is variation. There's bad and much worse. But I don't have a great example for you, unfortunately.
At least like in my head, the story I like tell myself about triple deckers is that like they were like that was an example of elasticity in Boston.
Yeah, that's true. Well, you just think about like post World War II. You want to talk about elasticity of the housing market? We've got a bunch of people coming back from war, and we need housing. And so, you know, our suburbs were built in those decades, ensuring that we had sufficient housing for World War II veterans. And so, across the country, our elasticity was pretty darn high, and the federal government was kind of behind that, right? Like, we need this housing, we're going to do it. And you know, GI Bill, we're going to educate, and we're going to house people, and we did it.
I also think lodging houses in Boston, turn of the century,
Yep.
a lot of single working people coming into the city from other parts of the country, other parts of New England. The market responded. We don't do it now, but we did back then.
So the second row, and then
So I have a question that might be either naive or vastly oversimplifying, but I'm curious when you talk about your budget, you're very well funded, the 750 million or so that you're spending on services. Do you have an estimate of what that translates into per person who's served? I know it's, probably varies. And then I'm wondering how that would compare to, so if that's more of an upstream effort and you're more of a downstream effort at Pine Street, how do those costs compare? And then my third, probably even less answerable question, because I research social drivers of health, is has anybody looked at the comparative health outcomes between people who are served more upstream and more downstream? And I get that there are big differences in the populations, as you both mentioned. Just any thoughts about that would be helpful.
Yeah, so I don't have the data in the head. I know that we served 750 million since the program started, because I just did a presentation on that. But I encourage you to look at our SSBF annual report.
Okay.
We've done annual reports ever since the program started, 2011, though most recently last month, February, 2 months ago, our FY21 information came out. And it really does a good job of outlining where the funding goes, what the grantees are doing, who's receiving it. You know it very well, Tom. Some of our
and there is a per capita number that is
in there.
That isn't it. If you see me after, I can get it to you.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
It's a dense read, but it's just it still has very good information, and actually it's what's used by Congress and other funders to help support our program for the future.
I think generally prevention's cheaper. Obviously, permanent supportive housing is much more expensive because it's targeting people with a disability who also need rental assistance and they need support. And Tom and Blue Cross Blue Shield a few years ago, and Tom can talk to it, did a study where we looked at cost savings by housing chronically homeless folks, really trying to get the social determinants cost. We didn't look at health. You want to talk about that?
Yeah, so I'll say two things real quickly. Just so the VA also does operate a downstream program, a permanent supportive housing program called HUD-VASH. So they have kind of both sides, right? Yeah, and that there is a body of work on kind of the health impacts of permanent supportive housing. I think I would say two things about that. One is what it shows is that absolutely people do reduce their utilization of expensive health services, shelter services, criminal justice services. In some cases, not always, the way that it gets messaged sometimes is that it's always going to save money, but in some cases, it's enough to offset the cost of the housing. The research on the impact of people's health outcomes, kind of from an objective standpoint, is a little bit more mixed. But I don't think that that's a bad thing. I mean, this is the purpose of this program really is to house people. We don't ask other programs to achieve different outcomes, right? So I think the way sometimes people get disappointed that this doesn't show a more positive impact on health outcomes. The thing to remember is a lot of the folks that are targeted for permanent supportive housing are coming in with really complex health needs. And if things don't get worse, that is actually probably a good outcome. There is some more research recently looking at the impact of just federal housing assistance, not specifically for folks who are homeless, on health outcomes. And that's showing some interesting stuff where you see most of an effect, and I've done a little bit of this, is by an income effect. So if you help people pay for housing, it frees up resources that they can spend on needed health care. So that's where you see kind of a big effect. Sorry to editorialize there for a second, but yes, this Blue Cross Blue Shield, so looking specifically at a program in Massachusetts, looking at people's use of mass health services, we did see an impact where you see a big drop in the cost of their health services, use of acute care services.
So I guess I could kind of answer her question. Double-edged sword. I work in mental health in Boston. We currently do work with mass health for families being able to get into housing. So we do all of their startup costs for them, which would be first, last. We try to do first and last, or last in security, or first in security. It depends on what the household is looking for. And then we try to use our RAP program to assist with, if they're asking first, last in security, then we get the RAP program to come on and assist us with whatever we weren't able to pay out. But my question specifically was for Pine Street and Bash. Specifically for Pine Street, I don't know who you're working with in Dorchester, but I sit on the WOW committee and I have not heard about your project that's coming up, and I do go through the argument.
Oh, you mean the hotel?
Yes,
yeah,
and I do go through the argument.
No. The hotel is not permitted.
Okay.
So we don't even have zoning relief. We're working on it. If there's anybody here from the mayor's office, by the way, Dana, don't slip out. By the way, no, believe me, you will though, if it gets permitted. So we're trying to get it permitted. And I think, to Adam's point, this is a pretty quick conversion if we can buy it. We're gonna turn the rooms into studio apartments, but we need permitting. We gotta buy the thing and do the construction. So I'm hoping it's down the road, but we don't know yet.
Information, because I'm always in the meeting, like, you're building this property, but this does not address what we need to do. They get tired of me in the meeting. Because I work with this I work with this population so often, and I have to argue that point because sometimes I'm looking at it from a family's perspective and coming from shelter, how that looks for a family that's coming from shelter that makes less than $15 an hour. How do you expect them to make 3 times their income in a way? It's unrealistic. And
Do
so
we have
your question.
No, okay,
Like to catch.
okay, all right. So I think just in the interest of
What I'm packing.
yeah. So I think just to be respectful of everyone's time, we'll have to stop there. I appreciate everyone coming, the really rich conversation. I know I will be sticking around and happy to talk to any other folks who have questions after. And just again, want to say thank you and a round of applause for our panel.